cusp of the Advent season. If you will notice in the lessons and Gospels, it ends at 24 Trinity. So the compilers of the lessons in the Gospels determined that since we are so close to Advent, when we have such a long Trinity season, we need to find a set of readings that will dovetail into the Advent season. Next Sunday is the Sunday before Advent, and then on the 1st of December, we actually are in the Advent season. And you know that the Advent season is a two-edged, if you will, season. Advent deals not only with the first coming of Christ, but it also talks about and implies the second coming of Christ. And as you can tell by this morning's gospel, we have overlap. And if you don't think that there's overlap, hopefully we'll be able to bring that out this morning. Before we get into this morning's gospel, as always, we really need to understand what is taking place here. So I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about context, content, and the consequences of this morning's gospel. The context of this morning's gospel is post-triumphal entry. The king has come. The Messiah has ridden in on his mule. Not the steed, not the chariot. The king has come humbly into his kingdom. And in chapter 21, we see all of the celebration and the joy of the triumphal entry. Jesus immediately goes to the temple and he cleanses the temple. So right after the triumphal entry, there's this sense of, I don't want to say doom, but there's certainly foreboding. Why is Jesus coming to the temple to cleanse the temple? And then for the rest of chapter 21, he teaches in the temple. He presents a number of parables and stories, and you can go through and look at that. Then in chapter 21, then from 21, chapter 22 to chapter 23, he judges Jerusalem. If you take those two chapters and you look at that, you can see that the experience of the triumphal entry is offset by the teaching of Christ and the judgment of Christ on Jerusalem. Then after he judges Jerusalem, we have chapters 24 and 25, which have been variously known as the teaching on the Mount or the Olivet Discourse. And this deals with Jesus judging the temple. Everybody gets wrapped up in the second coming, and that is also a part of this, and we will touch on that. But we're not going to talk about dispensationalism, sorry, Ron. But we are going to touch on what Jesus is doing here. One of the terms that becomes prominent in chapter 24 and 25, but primarily chapter 24, is the term parousia. Now, I'm going to read a couple of verses, and they're right out of this morning's gospel. And these verses will point out the word parousia. Matthew 24, verse 3, and he sat upon the Mount of Olives. The disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? Remember, Jesus had just judged Jerusalem, and he had just judged the temple, or he's judging the temple. And what shall be the sign of thy coming, parousia? And then the important phrase is, and of the end of the world. Verse 27, for as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Coming of the Son of Man. Verse 37, but as the days of Noah were, and that should automatically conjure up an image of what was going on, the image that Jesus was trying to present to his followers, so also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. And of course, verse 39, and they knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so also the coming of the Son of Man shall be. So you can see that the way that the word is translated, coming, the parousia is translated as arrival in some sense. Well, it's actually a compound word. It comes from two different Greek words. One's a preposition, the other's a noun. And the preposition means out of, beside, but more commonly from. But the Greek word, the second word, is ousia. And that is quite significant because this morning we read about 2 pages of definition of ousia. Ousia means being. So when you combine the 2 words, you come up with presence or coming. It's not the same as you arriving at a place. There's something more transcendent involved here. Even Plato uses this word in a sacral fashion. He used it as a habitation with the divine. So the concept of parousia is more than just an arrival. It's a representation of dwelling with the presence of deity. 10 out of the 15 total times the word is used in the New Testament is used in conjunction with the second coming of Jesus. Now, anytime you have a word like this, you always have to take it in the context. But think about that. The word is only used 15 times in the New Testament, and 10 times it's used of the coming of Christ. Specifically, his second coming. And that alone should impact your understanding of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and the alleged rapture issue, especially when you link 1st and 2nd Thessalonians to verse 29, which says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens be shaken. This imagery is pure Jewish apocalyptic imagery. I'm not going to actually read all of the verses. I just want to give you a sense of the Old Testament impact on the New Testament when it comes to this idea of the sun being darkened, the moon shall not give her light, etc. Isaiah 13:10, Ezekiel 32:7, which I will read in just a second. Joel 2:10, Joel 2:31. The stars shall fall from the sky, Isaiah 34:4. The powers of the heavens shall be shaken, Isaiah 34:4. Joel 2:10, Haggai 2:6 and 2:21. The sign of the Son of Man shall appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth shall mourn, Zechariah 12:10 and 12:12. They shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, Daniel 7:13 and 14. And he shall send forth his angels with a loud trumpet blast, Isaiah 27:13. And they shall gather his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of the heaven to the other, Deuteronomy 30, verse 4, and Zechariah 2:6. This was not an unfamiliar concept to the Jewish mind. They knew what it meant when Jesus spoke of the sun being darkened and the moon failing to give her light and the stars from heaven being fallen. So there is, in the content of this morning's gospel, this tremendous sense of foreboding. And remember that the question that was asked was, when shall these things be? When shall the end of the world come? Let me read Ezekiel 32:7. And when I shall put thee out, when I shall judge thee, I will cover the heaven, make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. So we are talking about judgment. And if we don't recall, it should be remembered, Advent is a penitential season. There is a sense of joy in the birth of Christ, but it is also a sense of reflection, a sense of taking account, which is what you see after this particular gospel, because you have the parable of the 10 virgins. You have numerous examples of Jesus warning people to be ready for this particular time. Remember when we discussed Ezekiel chapter 1, we talked about the glory cloud, what that signified? That it was, as it were, the heavenly court with Yahweh sitting on his throne, the veritable chariot of God being driven across the heavens with the heavenly court in tow. Well, this is what we're dealing with when we see God's presence being spoken of. The Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat itself, is called the throne of Yahweh. This is his coming. This is his presence as he sets up his people, his dwelling place in the tabernacle, his home in Jerusalem, or in other words, God's kingdom on earth. And what we are reading, what the disciples were hearing, was an answer to their question. Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? The term immediately cannot be emphasized more forcefully. You don't see a delay. You don't see a pause. There's no parentheses. When these things take place, like lightning from the east that passes into the west, the glory cloud, the throne of the God of the universe with the heavenly court is descending. Descending for what? Judgment. Now, you've heard me say in the past that at the point of Christ's crucifixion, the theoretical cosmic clock started ticking. At that point, at any time, he could return. His return was so anticipated that many Christians, even at this point in the first century, ceased to work. Okay, Jesus is coming back. I'm going to just hitch my wagon. I'm going to go wait. And if you look at church history, you will see what we used to call millennial madness. The turn of every century, for quite a number of years, people went nuts. And just a few years ago, not very long ago, 1999, all sorts of people went up to the mountains. They were waiting for Jesus to return. The anticipation of the immediate return of Christ is a part of Christian doctrine. We should be expecting him to come back at any second. The only problem is, he tells us very clearly, nobody knows the time, the day, or the hour. We don't know when he's coming back. The point being that you live your life at every moment as though Christ is going to walk through that door. Well, what are the consequences of this morning's gospel. Well, think about this. From chapter 21 to chapter 23, Jesus is teaching in the temple. And what is he teaching? About the wonders of the kingdom of God, about how great and glorious it is. You go back and you read those chapters. It is frightening. Because here's the king who arrives at his kingdom. He arrives in his house, his residence. He shows up at his own doorstep, and the first thing he does is he cleans house. And then he starts to preach. And every sermon is a condemnation. Every single one. And then when he's done, at the beginning of chapter 24, and this week was the first time I actually looked at this closely. It said Jesus leaves the temple. Well, it doesn't say Jesus leaves the temple. It says, and when Jesus left the temple. And when Jesus left the temple. Really simple words. And when Jesus left the temple. But the word when he left is in the aorist tense. And when I looked at that, that struck me. Now, I haven't found it anywhere else, so you don't have to buy this. This is my understanding of this, and I'm willing to, be corrected. But it said Jesus left the temple, the aorist tense. Aorist is a one-time definitive act in the past. In other words, he walked out of his own house. It's over. He left the temple. He came to his house in the triumphal entry. He found desolation and sin. He cleanses it. He preaches against it. And he walked out of his own house. God left the building. He was gone. Ik kavod. Spirit of the Lord has departed. And right before that, what does he do? After he gets through with this teaching, at the end of chapter 23, he looks at Jerusalem and cries. His people, in his place, in his home, brought the God-man to tears because of their sin and rejection of him. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Oh, how I would have gathered you as a hen gathers chicks under her wings. But you would not. And he condemns his home, the land that he prepared for his people. And then in this morning's gospel, he goes through 2 chapters of warning those people that are hearing what he's saying. The sun, the moon, the stars are all going to be darkened. He is telling them, do you remember what I did in creation? Where I took from darkness and I created light. I put the sun in the sky and the lesser light, the moon, and I spread the stars through the universe. Well, that now will be undone. Jesus is telling them, I am going to undo creation. I am going to bring it down. I'm going to destroy it all. Remember, as the days of Noah were, there was no illusion. And he said, and you will know this by the sign of the Son of Man coming in the clouds. My throne will descend on earth, And as this judgment is occurring, I am coming down to ensure that all of sin is vanquished. I am coming as the warrior comes with his chariot. I am coming as a warrior comes with his army. I am coming as a warrior comes to judge those in opposition. This is a horrifying statement. The abandonment of his house, the rejection of his home, the destruction of all that he created. But out of destruction and out of death comes life. Because as he took your dead souls and made them alive by the power of his sovereign grace, as he redeemed you, he will redeem his creation. Because remember, there is a new heaven and a new earth that he will create, where there will be no sin. The question you have to ask yourself is a question different than what the disciples asked Jesus. The question is not, nor should it ever be, when will these things occur? When will these things occur? Very simply, that shouldn't matter to any of us. We should all live as though it's going to happen right now. The question that we should ask is this: are we telling people that this is going to happen? Are we warning them the way Christ warned them? So the question I have to ask is, how urgently do we communicate that to unbelievers? Do we prepare ourselves for that time when he will return? Because we don't know when it's going to happen. Or do we think, that's a long way off. Yeah, Jesus isn't going to come tomorrow. Really? Did you get a tweet? Was there an email found in your inbox? Except for Phil, who doesn't have email. Did you get a postcard where Jesus said, don't worry about it? It'll be kind of like what we see in government. Oh, it'll be fixed by November, but they never tell you what November. It could be November of 3040, but we don't know. Did Jesus come back and say, don't worry about it, I won't be back until, December of, whatever. Are you prepared? And do we warn and urge and beg and plead with our friends to be prepared? Because this is the season that reminds us that this is going to happen. Advent is not only about the first coming, it's also about the second coming. And the abomination of desolation has taken place. The Romans walked into the temple of Jerusalem with their signets and their deities plastered all over their banners, and they set up their place of worship in the temple, and then they destroyed Jerusalem. So the judgment has occurred, and the clock is ticking.